So what we're going to talk about now, and I definitely want to kind of get it out of the way. It's external and internal respiration. Internal respiration is stupidly easy. External requires a little bit more conversation here. So let's start with external respiration. What I want you to understand is this. Here, you see the outer walls of alveoli. Do you see this multiple blood vessels that cover them? See that? This is pulmonary capillaries. Remember our cardiovascular system conversations? How blood goes via pulmonary arteries to the lungs, and it eventually enters the pulmonary capillaries, and then pulmonary capillaries drain into pulmonary veins that will bring the blood back to the heart. So this is the site of a gas exchange. I never mentioned, I'm just going to mention, that pulmonary circuit does not supply blood to the lung tissue itself. Lung tissue, like, lung stroma, the connective tissue that surrounds it, is supplied by so-called bronchial arteries. But those bronchial arteries are the part of the systemic circuit. They like regular, I don't remember, they branch off aorta somewhere, but they like regular arteries. They take oxygenated blood to this connective tissue and feed it, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Okay, got it out of the way. Now let's go back to our pulmonary capillaries. Essentially, what happens in the external respiration? Oxygen goes from your lungs into the blood, and CO2 goes from the blood back into the alveoli, right? To make this movement fast, you have to make sure that so-called respiratory membrane is extremely thin. So this is how respiratory membrane looks. There's a basement membrane, and remember, basement membrane is at the bottom of every epithelium. In this case, you have two epithelial layers. You have respiratory epithelium. So this is alveolus. And you have vascular epithelium. So this is blood. Okay, so this is the blood vessel right here. You see what I'm saying? This is alveolus. Now, if you look at the respiratory membrane, here, this illustration. Look, respiratory membrane, right? Why is it thin? Each cell, epithelial cell in the blood vessel and epithelial cell in the lung, they really, really thin. And the basement membranes of two epithelial layers are fused into one. So respiratory membrane is so thin that the gas exchange happens extremely quickly. Okay, we're good so far? Now, we need to mention two more cell types that can be found in the alveolus. Look at this. So another cell type is, so this is type 2. Alveolar cell produces surfactant. The purple one here is type 1 alveolar cell. So look at this. This is a squamous cell. Simple squamous epithelium here. Does that make sense? This one looks more cuboid. You see what I'm saying? Type 2 cells are cuboidal cells. And finally, right here, this will be alveolar macrophage. So this alveolar macrophage will kind of move around and will clean the debris in the lungs. Does that make sense? Are we good? Any questions on the cells of the alveolus? Now, immediately we can look at something here and find out what happens when respiratory membrane is damaged. Listen up. In emphysema, look at this. All these walls of the alveoli in the alveolar sac, they are destroyed. Are you following me? So now, instead of these multiple surfaces, you have one surface. In emphysema, the surface area of the respiratory membrane decreases. Am I clear? So gas exchange becomes less efficient. Good? Now imagine that you have pneumonia. You have a lung inflammation. Inflammation is accompanied, among other things, by edema. Are you with me? So accumulation of fluid in the lungs, inflammation of the lungs, will result in clogging that respiratory membrane. There's water here, right? Well, not water, but fluid, a lot of fluid here. In inflammatory damage to the respiratory membrane, you were asking, one of the consequences of pneumonia that is caused by coronavirus is inflammation of the respiratory membrane, and then during healing the normal membrane is replaced by the scar tissue. Does that make sense? So now, instead of proper gas exchange, you have nothing. You see what I'm saying? So people who recover from that pneumonia, many of them will never return to normal as they were before. Does that make sense? Like, people will experience, why you can hear people saying, even like 2, 3, 4 months after I recovered, I am still fatigued. I still have to catch my breath when I go up the stairs. Because their lungs are scarred. Are we good?
Are your lungs scarred from asthma?
Huh?
Are your lungs scarred from asthma?
No. Asthma is purely just obstructive disease. All you have is constriction of the respiratory passages. That's all. Lungs are fine. That make sense? Now, before we start talking about the gas exchange, I want to highlight a couple of laws. It's Dalton's law and Henry's law. So, when you have a mixture of gases, the total pressure of gases is equivalent to the so-called partial pressure of each individual component. Why this is important? It's not like super important, okay? But look what happens here. Atmospheric pressure in the air and in your lung. Well, pressure in the atmosphere and pressure in your lungs, they're really close. I mean, they're not equal when you inhale or exhale, right? But they're very close. We're not talking like 760 versus 500, right? They're very close. The point is, you have certain distribution of proportions, concentration of gases, so to say, in the air. The concentration of gases in your lungs will be slightly different. Why? First of all, because lungs are very humid, so there will be higher concentration of water vapors. Am I clear? And due to the presence of higher amounts of CO2, CO2 in the lungs is higher than the atmosphere. And since it's a pretty much, what I'm trying to tell you, the concentration of gases is a zero-sum game. If CO2 goes up, oxygen goes down, concentration-wise. Does that make sense? And another law, which is really cool, is Henry's law. And Henry's law states this. Partial pressure of gas in the water. Now, disclaimer, listen up. When we use the term partial pressure of gas, it is essentially a concentration, okay? Partial pressure of gas in the water is proportional to partial pressure of gas above the water. Does that make sense? Now, there was a product advertised that makes like soda, Soda Stream, I think. Yeah, right. So like you pour whatever like drink that you want to carbonate, and it will carbonate it. Well, I gotta tell you, I don't know about the United States. When I was a kid, Soviet Union, we had Soviet Soda Stream, which was essentially the same. You have a vessel, okay? You pour whatever you want in, and then we had little tanks, like little tiny tanks with CO2. There was some cap on it. So stick this tank, I don't remember, like pull the lever or something, and it increases the pressure of CO2 above your drink. Does that make sense? And it carbonates your drink. See what I'm saying? What happens to, I don't know, Coke when you open the can and leave it on the table? CO2 leaves because the pressure of CO2 in the Coke is higher than in the air, so CO2 will move from the higher pressure to lower pressure, to the air. That's it. We good? Why is it important? Basically it tells you that if you, hypothetically, if you increase the pressure of oxygen in the air that you inhale, it should increase the amount of oxygen that ends up in your blood. It's not as straightforward as we will see next time. I don't think we're going to have time for this today. But it kind of true. Okay? So let's talk about this. What happens in the lungs? What happens in the alveoli? Oxygen. I'm going to use some fancy color. Oxygen goes from the alveolus into the blood. Clear? And CO2 goes from the blood into the alveolus. Does that make sense? Now, let's define why it happens. Well, let's write down the concentrations of oxygen, CO2, and water in atmosphere. So, now, you know how much I despise the numbers? How I think it's useless to memorize the numbers. So this is why I'm not asking you to memorize the actual partial pressures or concentrations. This is what we're going to do. We're going to line up three gases. We're going to ignore nitrogen. Listen, we're going to ignore nitrogen because nitrogen comprises most of the air. Its partial pressures change slightly. So we're going to talk oxygen. We're going to talk CO2. And for that matter, we're going to talk water. So, now, this is what I want to do. Look. When you inhale, when air goes into your lungs, in your lungs, compared to atmosphere, the water concentration in the air that's in your lungs, is it higher than in the atmospheric air? Remember, your lungs are pretty damp. Well, air that is now in your lungs, compared to air that is in this classroom, concentration of water is higher where? In the lungs. So we can put a sign this, right? So more in the alveolus than in the atmosphere. What about CO2?
Higher in the atmosphere?
No,
Or, yeah.
in the lungs, because this. So in the alveolus, the concentration of CO2 is higher than in the atmosphere. Now, what about oxygen? Remember, it's a zero-sum game. So if some of that pressure, total pressure, is taken by water and CO2, it will automatically reduce the proportion of oxygen. Remember, we're talking about proportion. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, in external respiration, nevertheless, oxygen goes into the blood. So what can we say about the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus versus partial pressure of oxygen in the blood in the external respiration? Which one is higher? Gas goes from, pressure-wise, from which pressure to which pressure? Oh, come on. It's basically concentrations from high to low, right? So, the pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is higher than the pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries. This is why oxygen goes from the alveolus into the pulmonary capillaries. Does that make sense? Now what about CO2? I'm sorry. Pressure of CO2 in the alveolus compared to pressure of CO2 in the blood, in the pulmonary capillaries. Which sign should I put?
Pressure in the alveoli is less than.
Yes. Does that make sense? Now, number-wise, I don't really remember, and I don't really care that much. I think it's like 140, and there's 45 and 40, but nobody cares really at the end of the day. Does that make sense? Like, I want you to understand the pressure differences, the direction of movement. Okay? Are we clear so far? Now, what about internal respiration? Now remember, in internal respiration, we are talking about the gas exchange between the blood vessels and the tissue. So you, like any good gut-feeling epithelium, there's a basement membrane, there are endothelial cells, so here's blood, okay, and this one here is tissue. So in external respiration, check this out. Oxygen will go from blood into tissue, while CO2 will go from the tissue into blood. Okay? So I want you to put the signs for me here.
So the pressure of oxygen in the
Yes. Pressure, yes. Pressure.
Dioxide in the tissue is higher.
Higher, yes. Does that make sense? All you need to remember is that any gas always goes from higher pressure to the lower pressure. And this is something that, I understand why students get confused. Because they think about the pressure in a sense of like, inflating the balloon. The term pressure, we just use the term pressure, but it is essentially a concentration. Like if I replace it with concentration, we're talking about diffusion, that's all. We good? Now, the very last bit that will link pulmonary ventilation and external respiration is the ventilation contraction coupling, ventilation perfusion coupling. Now, before we jump on this, I want to remind you something. Listen, remember we were talking about tissue perfusion. Remember? Remember how we were talking about factors that affect tissue perfusion? And what was the main factor? It was concentration of CO2 in the tissue, right? So more CO2 in the tissue resulted in a dilation of blood vessels, right? That would bring more blood to deliver more oxygen and take more CO2 away. That was purely cardiovascular. We talked about it. Now, what is ventilation contraction coupling? Not contraction. I keep saying contraction. Perfusion coupling. So imagine that there is an alveolus here. Alveolus, which contains a lot of oxygen. So partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus goes up, right? What is the main function of the blood in the pulmonary capillaries? What does it do? The very basic level. You need to explain it like a 5-year-old. What does the blood in the pulmonary capillaries do, essentially? It picks up oxygen, right? Now, if you have a lot of oxygen here, how do you want to change the amount of blood that reaches this alveolus? Yeah, you want to bring more blood. Does that make sense? You want to bring more blood to the alveolus with a lot of oxygen. Are we clear? So when partial pressure of oxygen in an alveolus goes up, essentially arterioles blood vessels that lead to that alveolus dilate. Are we clear? That brings more oxygen, obviously, and, so these arterioles that lead to the alveolus will dilate, and the perfusion of the alveolus will go up. Now, what about CO2? What is an ultimate function of an alveolus in regards to CO2? What does your lung do with CO2? Very simply. Exhale, yeah, you exhale CO2, right? So if the partial pressure of CO2 in the alveolus goes up, your lungs want to get rid of CO2 as fast as they can. Makes sense, right? As fast as they can. How can they do it? They can expand the bronchioli. So bronchioles from it dilate. Does that make sense? Now, for a concluding remark here, listen up. We're going to try to bring it together here in the conversation, and this is what you see. First of all, I want to remind you again, we have to use a very reductionist approach. We break down the continuous physiological process into individual steps that do not exist really as individual steps. But if we try to merge the two, alveolus has a lot of oxygen. So blood vessels dilate and bring more blood, right? That reduces amount of oxygen, but at the same time, more blood means more CO2. So now the amount of CO2 in that alveolus increases. What does that mean for us? Dilation of the bronchioles, right? CO2 leaves, well, not only CO2 leaves, but also through those bronchioles, oxygen goes. So you have this teeter-totter kind of situation when it's not like a constant rigid tube, right? Make sense? It's variable diameter of bronchioles and blood vessels constantly regulating, auto-regulating the amount of blood that goes in, the amount of air that goes in. Does that make sense? Questions? Good? Okay, awesome.